A wealthy and lonely man encountered a poor woman and was shocked to see that her two children were exactly like him. What she told him. John Smith awoke, as he did every morning, in the silent opulence of his mansion. Surrounded by valuable art, exclusive designer furniture, and views of a garden that seemed to be pulled from a dream, his life appeared perfect. To the world, John had it all. At 45, he was the owner of a business empire that he had painstakingly built, now granting him the power and control he so valued. However, behind every luxury was an emptiness he could not fill. He walked down the long hallway of his home, his footsteps echoing on the polished marble, stopping in front of a large window overlooking the garden. The morning light bathed the perfectly manicured lawn, but his gaze was distant. In his mind, an old wound reopened, one that had been buried for years under layers of work and success. Marina, the woman he once believed would be his lifelong partner. They had been engaged, ready to marry, until she betrayed him, choosing another man and leaving John with a broken heart and a distrust he could never overcome. Since then, he had resolved never to let himself be swept away by emotions he could not control. He had learned to use business as his refuge, his excuse to avoid any emotional closeness. Instead of family, he had important meetings. Instead of love, he had million-dollar contracts. And instead of trust, he had an impenetrable wall protecting what remained of his heart. That morning, as he prepared for his day, he reviewed the messages his personal assistant, Linda, had left him. Linda was impeccable in her work, efficient, quick, and able to anticipate John's needs before he even expressed them. She had been working with him for nearly a decade, and although she often seemed to be the only person who genuinely cared for him, their relationship was strictly professional. For John, opening up was a weakness, a door he would never leave ajar again. Then there was Alfred, his loyal driver, who waited for him every morning at the same time. He had worked for John for over 15 years, and although he knew much about his boss, he never dared to cross the line of formality. To Alfred, John was a man to respect and admire, but never truly know, and John liked to keep that distance. The drive to his office passed in silence, as always. Phone calls and constant notifications on his phone distracted his mind from thoughts he preferred not to entertain. When he arrived at his building, the formal greetings from his employees and the quick conversations about figures and strategies returned him to the world where he felt most comfortable, that of numbers and control. But that day, something felt different. For the first time in a long while, John felt an urgency to escape. There was something about the monotony of his perfect life that was unbearable. He decided he needed a break, a moment outside his calculated and predictable routine. Without telling anyone where he was going, he asked Alfred to take him somewhere quieter, away from the business bustle. Alfred drove him to a park in a humble neighborhood, one that John hadn't visited in years. He got out of the car, not knowing exactly what he was searching for, but he needed fresh air, something to disconnect him from his usual world. He walked along the park's paths, feeling a strange mix of relief and discomfort. John was not someone who typically stopped to enjoy life's simplicity, but at that moment, something inside him urged him to let go of the control he exerted over everything. Lost in his thoughts, he barely noticed the two children running wild in the park until one of them collided with him. John staggered slightly, surprised by the impact. The boy, barely 7 years old, quickly apologized, a mischievous grin on his face. At first, John didn't think much of it until his eyes met the boy's. It was as if time stood still. The child in front of him was an exact copy of himself at that age. It wasn't just a vague resemblance. It was an almost perfect reflection. John looked at the other boy, who was approaching with a nervous expression, and the impact was the same. The second boy was also identical to him. His heart began to race in his chest. How was this possible? Before he could process what he was seeing, a young woman, her face tired and hurried, rushed toward the children, calling them by their names, Tommy and Arthur. The woman, Anna, quickly apologized and tried to take them away, visibly uncomfortable with the situation. But John couldn't let it go. He couldn't simply ignore what he had just seen. Those children were identical to him. A whirlwind of questions started to form in his mind, and for the first time in a long while, he felt his life, his controlled and methodical world, was about to change. "Wait," he said, his voice firm yet laden with confusion. Anna halted, visibly uneasy. The children looked at her, waiting for a sign of what to do next. "I need to talk to you," John insisted, still unable to fully process what was happening. "Please." Anna hesitated, but something in John's gaze made her agree. They headed to a nearby cafe, where Anna's nerves were palpable. John could barely contain his bewilderment, but he knew he needed answers. As they sat down, John looked at the children, at Tommy and Arthur, and a question began to form in his mind, one he dared not ask, but that burned within him. How is it possible that those children are just like me? And so, without realizing it, John began a journey that would lead him to confront the past he had tried so hard to bury and discover truths that would forever change the course of his life. The air inside the small cafe was thick with palpable tension. John, usually so confident and composed, could barely contain the whirlwind of thoughts surging through him. Sitting across from him, Anna kept her head down, stirring her coffee with trembling hands, while the twins, Tommy and Arthur, played distractedly at the table. To any outsider, they would just appear to be two unruly kids and their exhausted mother. But for John, this encounter was much more than a coincidence. It was a mystery that was gnawing at him from within. The children stole furtive glances between giggles and whispers, oblivious to the weight of the conversation about to unfold. John watched them from the corner of his eye, increasingly fascinated and disturbed by the inexplicable resemblance. Tommy and Arthur weren't just similar to him, they were identical, as if time had reversed, reflecting him in those two children he did not know, but who somehow seemed to belong to his own story. "Thank you for agreeing to sit down and talk," John broke the silence, trying to sound calm, even as his mind continued to whirl. "I can't help but notice the similarity between the children and me." Anna looked up briefly, barely meeting his gaze, but she didn't respond immediately. Her eyes reflected a mix of fear and nervousness, as if she were trapped in a situation she didn't know how to handle. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, searching for the right words, or perhaps a way to escape. "They're just kids, sir," she finally said in a low voice. "They resemble many people, I suppose. Sometimes coincidences are just like that." John wasn't fooled. He felt deep in his gut that there was more to it. Coincidences weren't that precise, not like this. Tommy and Arthur didn't just share some features. They were like a mirror of his childhood. And the way Anna skirted the subject only heightened his suspicion. "I don't believe in coincidences, Anna," he replied, his tone firmer, more probing. "Not when I see something so evident. Those kids, they look too much like me. I want to know how that's possible." Anna's face visibly paled. She placed her spoon down on the table with a soft clink, and for a moment looked at the children with an almost protective tenderness. It was clear she wanted to shield them from something or someone, and John could see it in the way her body tensed as she spoke of them. Anna's discomfort grew as he pressed her, but he couldn't afford to let this opportunity slip away. He needed answers. "Look, Mr. Smith," Anna began, her voice shaky as she struggled to maintain her composure. "My children don't have a father. Well, I mean, I've raised them alone. It's hard, but there's nothing more I can tell you." Anna's words hung in the air, but lacked weight. John knew there was more to this story. The children looked at him with innocent curiosity, but behind those bright eyes was something that connected him to them, something he couldn't ignore. How could it be that these kids existed without him knowing anything? It was as if reality itself was bending before him. "And the father?" he pressed, this time his tone more severe. Who is the father of the children? Anna swallowed hard and looked at Tommy and Arthur again, as if seeking strength from them to respond. But every word she tried to say got caught in her throat. She knew that the more she answered, the closer the truth would come to light, and that truth could change everything. What worried her most was what could happen once John knew it all. "It doesn't make sense to talk about the father," she finally said, her voice trembling more than before. "I'm the one who takes care of them. I'm the one who has been with them from the beginning. There's no one else who needs to worry about them." John clenched his jaw. He was unwilling to accept vague answers. The twins weren't just a physical reflection of him. There was something in them that awakened a deeper connection. He could feel an undercurrent of emotion starting to pull him in, something he had buried for years, a sense of belonging, of responsibility, that overwhelmed him in a way he hadn't expected. It was as if, in an instant, all the years of loneliness he had endured confronted a reality he hadn't asked for, but that had somehow always been there. Anna, aware of John's growing interest and feeling that she was losing control of the conversation, became increasingly anxious. She shifted in her seat, trying to shield her children from John's insistent gaze. "Mr. Smith, I don't want to be rude, but I've told you all I can," she responded, a mix of firmness and fear in her voice. "I'm not interested in creating more problems." John was about to reply when a sound interrupted him. Tommy and Arthur, unknowingly, broke the tension when one of them accidentally spilled a glass of juice on the table. The situation, which could have been frustrating for any adult, sparked a small nervous laugh between the twins. Surprisingly, John wasn't annoyed. Instead, he looked at them with a kind of fascination. Was this how he was as a child? For a brief moment, the tension dissipated, but Anna remained alert. She seized that respite to rise from the table. "I think it's time to go," she said, taking the children by the hand. John didn't want to push her any further, not that day. Despite his frustration, he knew he wouldn't get any more answers for now. But this wasn't over. He knew it. And by the way Anna looked at him before leaving, she knew it too. "This isn't finished," John murmured to himself, watching Anna and the twins walk away from the cafe. His heart continued to pound. He sensed there was something deeper, something Anna wasn't revealing. And he would uncover it, even if he had to move heaven and earth. The twins had shaken him to his core, and that shake was beginning to tear down the walls he had built over the years. As he watched the park from the cafe window, with the images of Tommy and Arthur still etched in his mind, a feeling he had avoided for years began to wash over him. It was uncertainty, but also a spark of hope, a reflection of something he had never allowed into his life. Something had changed, and John knew it. Those children had opened a door that he had kept shut for so long, and although he couldn't see what lay behind it, he was determined to find out. With a resolute look, he rose from his seat, aware that what had just happened wasn't a mere chance encounter in a park. No, this was just the beginning. The days following his encounter with Anna and the twins felt endless to John. He returned to his routine, but something inside him had changed. At the office, the calls and meetings no longer captured his full attention, and the figures that once brought him satisfaction now seemed irrelevant. His mind was elsewhere, in that park, in that little cafe, on the faces of Tommy and Arthur, the two children who looked at him with the same curiosity he felt for them. In the past, John had been able to bury any thought that didn't contribute to his success. Emotions, painful memories, everything he couldn't control, he isolated deep in his mind. But this time was different. Tommy and Arthur, with their incredible physical resemblance and the palpable emotional connection he felt toward them, disoriented him. He couldn't simply shut the door on what he had discovered. The mystery of the children, Anna's evasiveness, and the growing suspicion that something was being hidden from him consumed him with every passing moment. Despite all his efforts to focus on work, his mind always returned to the same question. Who were those children, and why were they identical to him? That day, as he walked through the halls of his company, observing his employees like cogs in a well-oiled machine, John realized something. He couldn't keep ignoring the situation. If there was one thing to learn in business, it was that a good businessman didn't leave questions unanswered. And this time, those questions were much closer to home than he had ever allowed anything to be. After making that decision, John left his office in the hands of Linda with instructions not to be disturbed and headed to his car. Alfred, as always, waited outside the building. When John got into the vehicle, he gave an address, one he had meticulously searched for since his encounter with Anna. He was determined to see her again, and this time he wouldn't accept excuses or evasions. He needed answers. The journey to the modest neighborhood where Anna lived was quick, but in John's mind, it felt like an eternity. When they finally arrived, he found himself in front of a simple, worn apartment building, a stark contrast to the opulence he was accustomed to. The difference between their worlds had never been more evident, but at that moment, he didn't care. He rang the doorbell with a mix of determination and unease. After a few moments of silence, the door slowly opened, revealing Anna with a surprised expression. She hadn't expected to see him, especially not at her home. Tommy and Arthur were inside, playing with small plastic toys on the living room floor. Their laughter filled the space, but John could barely concentrate on them. His eyes were locked on Anna. "We need to talk," he said, with a firmness that left no room for doubt. Anna nodded, although her face clearly revealed her discomfort. She stepped aside to let him in and led him to a small table in the living room. Tommy and Arthur peeked curiously from across the room, but Anna asked them to keep playing. She didn't want them to hear what was about to unfold. When they both sat down, silence settled like a heavy blanket between them. John was the first to break it. "I can't stop thinking about what I saw in the park, Anna," he said, his voice calm yet tense. "Those kids, Tommy and Arthur, it can't just be a coincidence. I want the truth. I need to know who they really are." Anna looked away, clearly nervous. She was trapped. The answers John sought frightened her, not because she couldn't give them, but because she understood what those answers meant. For so long, she had kept her secret under control, but now she was on the edge, and any word she uttered could change everything. "I already told you before, John," she began softly, almost a whisper. "The children don't have a father. At least not in the way you think." John frowned. There was something more in those words. He felt Anna was about to say something important, but she continued to resist. "That doesn't make sense," he insisted, his frustration growing. "It's not just the resemblance, Anna. I feel it in my bones. There's something else here, something you're not telling me. Why are you so resistant to being honest with me? Do they have something to do with me?" Anna's face hardened, and her hands began to tremble slightly on the table. She knew she couldn't keep hiding the truth much longer. However, the consequences of revealing it terrified her. John was a powerful man, used to having control over everything around him. If he found out what had really happened, what would he do with that information? But before she could say anything more, Arthur ran up to them with a beaming smile, proudly showing off a drawing he had made. John looked at him tenderly, and for a moment, all the walls he had built over the years crumbled. The boy looked at him with a mix of admiration and innocence, unaware that the man before him was about to change their lives forever. Anna, watching the interaction, knew the moment had come. She couldn't keep dodging. John deserved the truth, even though she feared what that truth might unleash. With a deep breath, she looked directly at John, a mix of resignation and fear in her eyes. "You're right, John," she finally said, her voice breaking. "The children have more to do with you than you can imagine. But the story isn't simple. 8 years ago..." She paused, swallowing hard, as if the words were too difficult to say. "I was desperate to have children. I couldn't afford conventional treatment, so I turned to a sperm bank. I didn't know who the donor was. They didn't give me that information. But What I never knew was that... Anna looked him straight in the eyes, the truth spilling out like an overflowing river. They used your DNA, John. Tommy and Arthur are your children. Time seemed to stop for John. Anna's words echoed in his head like an endless refrain, each one laden with a reality he had never considered possible. His children. Those two kids now looking at him with innocence from the living room were his children. He felt the ground crumble beneath his feet. The control he valued so much had vanished in an instant. His children. He didn't know what to feel. Anger, confusion, fear, all swirled within him in a whirlwind. How had this happened without him knowing? His life was supposed to be under control, but now fate had dealt him one of the most astonishing cards. Anna, nervously, waited for John to process what she had just said. The silence in the room was heavy, charged with uncertainty and repressed emotions. Meanwhile, John could only stare at Tommy and Arthur, unsure whether to feel pain for what had been taken from him or joy for what he had suddenly gained. The silence continued, relentless, as the gears of his mind turned, trying to find any logic in what he had just heard. But there was no logic to this. He had been a father all this time without knowing it, and now that he knew, his life would never be the same. The silence that followed Anna's revelation was like an abyss. John sat at the small table in her living room, unable to process what he had just heard. Anna's words resonated in his mind, like a sentence reconfiguring every aspect of his life. Tommy and Arthur were his children. His DNA had been used without his consent. 2 lives created from him, and he hadn't even had a chance to choose. "It can't be," he whispered, almost to himself. The words escaped his lips with disbelief as his mind twisted, seeking a logical explanation for something that defied everything he had always considered under his control. Anna remained silent, sitting across from him, tense and with her face filled with fear and guilt. She knew that this conversation would be difficult, but she wasn't prepared for the emotional whirlwind it had unleashed. She could see the shock and confusion in John's eyes and feared what would come next. She herself had lived for years with the weight of that secret, but letting it go, finally revealing it to the man in front of her, made everything feel more real, more dangerous. "I know it's hard to accept," Anna began, her voice trembling. "But it's the truth. The sperm bank. They didn't tell me who you were. I never knew until I saw you in the park that day. It was a coincidence I couldn't foresee. I didn't know Tommy and Arthur were yours. Not until that moment." John stood up abruptly, unable to remain seated in a state of shock. He walked to the window, staring out unseeingly, breathing deeply as he tried to contain the fury beginning to boil inside him. How could something like this happen? He, a man who had always had complete control over his life, now discovered that 2 children carried his blood without his permission, without him ever knowing they existed. "How could they do this without my consent?" he asked, his voice restrained, filled with latent anger. John turned to Anna, demanding answers. "How can a sperm bank use my DNA without me knowing?" Anna swallowed hard, feeling small before the emotional storm raging within John. She didn't have all the answers. She only knew that her desperate desire to be a mother had led her down a path filled with uncertainty, and now she saw the chaos that decision had caused. "I don't know," she admitted sincerely. "Back then, I just wanted to be a mother. I was desperate. I had no resources, no clear future. And that sperm bank offered an accessible solution for women like me. They didn't ask me questions. They just promised me I could have the children I had always dreamed of." The tone in her voice revealed the mix of shame and guilt she had carried since then. Anna knew she had done what she believed was right at the time, but she never imagined that her decision would be linked to a web of lies much larger. John listened, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something darker lurked behind all of this. How could a sperm bank, a supposedly regulated organization, use his DNA without authorization? Something didn't add up, and although Anna was also a victim in this story, that didn't lessen his rage. "This doesn't make sense," he murmured, more to himself than to Anna. John clenched his fists, his gaze fixed on a distant point, as if trying to impose some kind of logic on what was happening. "I need to get to the bottom of this. It can't end like this." Anna looked at him with concern. She knew that John wouldn't rest until he obtained justice, but that meant exposing something she had tried to hide for years. Anna had always feared that a man like John, with his power and resources, could use that against her. She hadn't sought trouble. She only wanted to protect her children. But now she feared that this revelation would change everything for them. "What are you going to do?" she finally asked, fearful of the answer. John looked at her, his dark eyes filled with determination. "I'm going to find out what really happened," he said coldly. "I will investigate this sperm bank, and when I discover who was responsible for this, I will make them pay. No one plays with my life like this." Anna felt a knot in her stomach. She could sense the intensity of John's determination, and while part of her wanted justice to be served, she also knew that once John started that fight, there would be no turning back. He had the resources to see this through to the end, and that scared her. "And what about the kids?" she asked softly, glancing at Tommy and Arthur, who were still innocently playing, oblivious to the emotional hurricane surrounding them. "They aren't to blame for anything. I just want to protect them." John's expression softened for a moment. He looked at the children, those small beings who, in some inexplicable way, belonged to him. Despite the chaos in his mind, there was something in their gaze that touched him deeply, a connection he could not deny, but that terrified him. "I won't take them away, Anna," he finally said, in a gentler tone. "Not now, but I can't ignore that they are my children. I can't move forward without knowing what happened and how they were created." Anna nodded, grateful for the implicit promise, but still feeling a mix of relief and fear. She knew John was a powerful man, and although he had promised not to take the kids away for now, she feared what could happen if the case became more complicated. She had raised Tommy and Arthur alone, struggling every day to give them the best. But now, with John in their lives, everything had changed. As John stood up to leave, Anna watched him closely, knowing that her relationship with him was about to change forever. The children were no longer just hers, and although John hadn't claimed anything yet, Anna could feel that the storm hadn't passed. In fact, it was just beginning. Before leaving, John turned to her one last time. "I'm going to investigate, Anna, and when I know the truth, we'll talk again." Anna nodded, watching him disappear through the door, knowing that what lay ahead wouldn't be easy. When the door closed behind him, Anna let out a sigh she had been holding since everything began. She stood there, watching her children as they played in the living room, wondering what the future held for them with John in their lives. Meanwhile, in his car, John could barely think of anything other than the investigation he was about to begin. That sperm bank had played with his life in a way he would never have allowed. And now, with the truth finally in his hands, he was preparing to unleash a battle that would change more lives than he could imagine. John hadn't slept well since the conversation with Anna. No matter how hard he tried to focus on work, his mind kept returning to the same unsettling reality. Tommy and Arthur were his children. The man who had always had control over every aspect of his life now found himself in a situation that defied any logic or planning. That morning, upon arriving at his office, Linda, his efficient assistant, observed him with concern. John's usual composure was absent. Even his gestures seemed tenser, more abrupt. Still, she didn't dare ask what was wrong. John was not someone you talked to about personal matters, and Linda knew that well. John spent most of the morning reviewing documents without really reading them, his thoughts always returning to the same place, to those two children who, unbeknownst to him, had been born of his own blood. He didn't know what to do with that information. Should he take legal action? Should he demand some sort of control over the children? Or should he simply leave things as they were? By noon, he succumbed to the need to act. He knew he couldn't remain submerged in uncertainty any longer. He took his phone and called Javier, the private investigator who had worked for him on sensitive cases in the past. Javier was discreet, efficient, and knew how to operate in the shadows. John asked him to thoroughly investigate the sperm bank that had used his DNA without permission. "I need to know how it was possible for them to use my DNA without my consent," he told him firmly. "I want names, dates, all the details. Do it quickly." Javier accepted the task without asking questions. He knew that when John called, it wasn't for anything trivial. As he hung up, John felt a small spark of control return to his life. But he knew this was just the beginning. The answers he sought would likely lead him down an even more complicated path. That afternoon, he decided to do something he had never done before: visit the children. He didn't know what to expect from that interaction, but he felt a strange need to see them again, to try to understand what they meant in his life. Anna, though surprised by the visit, let him in. There was something in John's expression that bewildered her, a mix of determination and confusion she had never seen in him. The children were playing in the small living room, their laughter filling the air with an innocence that contradicted the conflict reigning in the adults. When John entered the room, Tommy and Arthur stopped and looked at him with curious eyes. To them, John was simply the man they had met in the park, someone who had caught their attention, but whose importance they did not yet comprehend. For John, however, those little ones were a blend of his past and his future, two lives that, in some way, were intertwined with his own, even though he had never wished for it. "Do you want to play?" Tommy asked, holding a toy car in his hand. John, surprised by the child's naturalness, hesitated for a moment. He had never played with children. He didn't know how to do it. But something inside him, a part that had remained buried for years, pushed him to accept the invitation. He crouched down next to them and took one of the toys, awkwardly mimicking their actions. Anna, watching from a distance, couldn't help but feel uneasy. While she was grateful that John was taking an interest in the children, she feared what that might mean for the future. John was powerful, and if he decided to claim the kids as his own, she knew she couldn't compete with him. The very thought terrified her. But as the minutes passed, John began to relax. The children, with their natural enthusiasm, pulled him into their world of fantasy, where everything was simple, where the tension he had carried since discovering the truth did not exist. He found himself smiling, something rare for him, and feeling a connection he hadn't expected. Was this what it felt like to be a father? The thought shook him. He had never imagined forming a family, much less under these circumstances. But now that he was there, something inside him was beginning to change. After a couple of hours, John said goodbye to the children. Tommy and Arthur, with their typical energy, waved goodbye without fully comprehending the importance of that moment. But for John, that visit had been a turning point. He got into his car with a strange sense of satisfaction mixed with unease. He knew this wasn't the end. He had begun a path from which he could no longer turn back. That night, Anna stayed awake long after the children had gone to bed. John's visit had stirred up old fears in her, especially the thought that he might try to take the children away from her. She knew John was not a man who easily accepted things as they were. If there was something he couldn't control, he took it under his dominion. And though he seemed calm for now, Anna couldn't shake the feeling that this calm was merely the prelude to a storm. She knew she would have to protect her children, not just from Michael, her ex-husband, who was becoming increasingly present in her life with calls and veiled threats, but also from the possibility that John might take legal action to claim the children. She had raised Tommy and Arthur alone, fought for them, and she wouldn't allow anyone to take them away from her. However, as the days passed, she felt she was losing control of her own destiny. On the other hand, John was also beginning to grapple with his internal conflict. Every time he saw Tommy and Arthur, he felt more connected to them, but that connection scared him. He had always been a rational man, someone who kept his emotions in check, but now he found himself in the midst of an emotional battle He didn't know how to win. Days later, Javier, the investigator, brought him news. The sperm bank had been operating under a broader network of corruption than John had imagined. They had illegally used the DNA of several wealthy men without their consent for in vitro fertilization procedures, and John wasn't the only one affected. The implications were enormous, both legally and emotionally. John then knew he had to make a decision, to move forward with the case, exposing what had happened and fighting for justice, or to protect the children and Anna, avoiding a scandal that could destroy the stability of everyone involved. The internal struggle consumed him. He didn't want to be the villain in this story, but he also couldn't ignore what had been done to him. In the days that followed, John remained silent, processing the information while his relationship with Anna remained tense. Both knew a decision was looming, one that would forever change the dynamic between them and the children. Finally, John decided to proceed with the investigation. He couldn't let the people behind that bank continue operating with impunity, even if it meant facing more complications. But in his heart, he knew he would also have to find a balance between seeking justice and protecting Tommy and Arthur. He had gotten to know them, and he couldn't let them pay the price for others' mistakes. Anna couldn't shake the feeling that something dark loomed over her. Since John's last visit, the tension in her life had multiplied. Not only was there the constant fear that John would assert some kind of claim over Tommy and Arthur, but now a much closer and more terrifying threat had resurfaced: Michael, her ex-husband. For years, Anna had managed to escape the nightmare that was her marriage to Michael. After years of abuse, she had fled from him, taking the twins with her when they were still small. Michael had been a violent and controlling figure, someone Anna feared more than anyone else in the world. She knew that if he found them, he would do everything possible to manipulate and destroy what little she had managed to build through hard work and sacrifice. In recent weeks, Michael had begun to reappear in her life. At first, it was subtle. Text messages filled with veiled threats, calls that Anna didn't answer, but that always appeared on her phone as a reminder that he was watching her. Then, Michael had started to show up more openly, appearing in places she frequented, parked near the children's school, as if he wanted to remind her that she couldn't escape him so easily. Anna lived with the constant fear that Michael would once again violently intrude into their lives, and now, with John involved, the danger seemed even greater. Michael was a cunning man, and if he found out that John was the biological father of the twins, he wouldn't hesitate to use that information to blackmail him, manipulate him, and squeeze out as much money as possible. For Michael, money was power, and John represented a perfect opportunity. John, for his part, continued to deal with the investigation into the sperm bank. Javier, his private investigator, continued to uncover layers of corruption involving multiple influential figures. But while John immersed himself deeper into the legal conflict, he couldn't shake his growing concern for Anna and the children. Although John had promised he wouldn't seek custody of Tommy and Arthur, each passing day brought a greater sense of responsibility toward them. He had gotten to know them better, shared moments with them, and although he would never admit it, he was beginning to feel like their father. One day, while John was in his office, he received an unexpected call from Anna. The urgency in her voice put him on high alert immediately. "John, I need to talk to you. It's important. I can't do it over the phone," she said, her voice heavy with concern. "Please, can we meet today?" Without hesitation, John agreed. Something in Anna's tone told him that things had reached a critical point. They arranged to meet at a discreet cafe, away from public attention. When John arrived, Anna was already waiting for him, her face visibly pale and tense. The woman in front of him was very different from the one he had first met. There was something more than nervousness in her expression. It was fear, a fear that John recognized immediately. "What's happening, Anna?" he asked, leaning forward at the table, concern evident on his face more than he intended. Anna looked around, as if fearing someone was watching them, and then lowered her voice. "It's Michael. He's back." The name dropped onto the table like a stone. John didn't know all the details of Anna's history with Michael, but he knew enough to understand that he was a dangerous man. Anna had fled from him years ago, and just mentioning his name made her skin crawl. "What has he done?" John asked, his tone bordering on urgency. Anna rubbed her hands together, visibly nervous. "It started with messages, calls. But now I've seen him near the kids' school. I know he's watching us. And—" Anna swallowed hard before continuing. "I think he's found out about you. He knows who you are, John. He knows you're the biological father of Tommy and Arthur." John felt a wave of fury wash over him. Michael not only represented a danger to Anna and the children, but now, knowing about his biological connection, he had a new tool to exploit. Anna's fears were not unfounded. Michael would likely see in him a source of power and money, and he would do everything possible to exploit that. "What do you want me to do?" John asked, his voice firm but laden with a sense of protection he hadn't felt in years. Anna looked him in the eyes, struggling against the tears that threatened to spill over. "I don't know. I don't know how to stop him. I've tried everything. I don't want the kids to get caught up in this. I've already suffered so much with Michael. I can't let him get close to Tommy and Arthur." John's heart hardened as he listened to her. Michael was a threat, and he knew what he had to do. John was not someone to sit idly by while a latent threat grew. He had spent his life facing challenges, and although family matters were new to him, his protective instinct toward the children couldn't be ignored. "The children will be protected, Anna," he said, with a determination that left no room for doubt. "I won't let Michael touch them. Or you." Anna felt a mix of relief and fear. She knew John had the resources and strength to protect them, but she also feared that his intervention might make things worse. Michael was not someone who gave up easily, and if he saw John getting involved, he would surely intensify his threats. For him, the children and their connection to John would be a perfect weapon to manipulate the situation to his advantage. "I don't want this to spiral out of control," Anna said in a desperate tone. "Michael is not just dangerous, he's unpredictable. If he feels like he's losing, he'll do anything." John nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Michael was not just a problem from Anna's past. He now represented an imminent risk to the children. And while John had planned to resolve his legal conflict with the sperm bank in a controlled and strategic manner, Michael's appearance had complicated everything. "I will make sure Michael doesn't bother you again." John paused, measuring his words. "But I need you to trust me, Anna. I won't let anyone harm you or the children." Anna, though still scared, nodded slowly. She knew she didn't have many options. She had lived too long under Michael's shadow, and she couldn't keep running. And although John was a complicated man, at that moment, he was the only one who could protect her family. When John stood up from the table, his mind was already racing, planning the next steps. He needed to protect the children and Anna from Michael, but he also had to proceed with the investigation into the sperm bank. The situation was getting complicated, and with each passing day, he felt the control he valued so much slipping away. That night, John contacted Javier, his private investigator. He knew that if Michael was a problem, he couldn't rely solely on legal measures. Javier had contacts who could help keep Michael monitored, and more importantly, at bay. "I need you to find everything you can about Michael," John ordered, urgency in his voice. "I want to know who his contacts are, what he's been doing, and where he is right now." Javier accepted the mission without hesitation. He knew that when John gave an order like this, it was because things had reached a critical point. And while he had investigated many things for him before, he could feel that this situation was different. This time, John wasn't just protecting his image or his company. He was protecting a family that, though he had never sought it, had now become his priority. As John hung up the phone, he felt a mix of rage and determination. Michael was not going to destroy what he was beginning to build. Tommy and Arthur were his children, and while he was still grappling with what that meant, he knew one thing for sure. He would do whatever it took to protect them. The war had begun. In the days following his meeting with Anna, John began to notice how his once controlled and predictable life was transforming. Business, which had always been his refuge, began to take a back seat. Now there was something much more important demanding his attention: Tommy and Arthur. The children, who at first represented an unsettling mystery, had become a constant presence in his mind. And the most surprising thing for John was that, despite how uncomfortable he felt at first, he couldn't help but want to spend more time with them. The first time he offered to take them to the park, Anna looked at him in surprise. Although the tensions between them still lingered, Anna realized that for the sake of the children, it was better to allow John to be part of their lives. At first, it was a cautious relationship, marked by uncertainty and the emotional barriers both had erected. But the children, oblivious to any conflict, treated him with the same naturalness they showed with their toys. John found himself in completely new territory. He had never imagined being an active part of a child's life, much less of two who had entered his life so unexpectedly. The world he knew, where everything was under his control, wobbled before the boundless energy of Tommy and Arthur. They were mischievous, full of questions, and completely indifferent to the seriousness that had always defined John. One afternoon, as they walked together in the park, Arthur, with his usual curiosity, asked John, "Why don't you ever come to play with us?" he said, with that innocence that only children possess. "Mom says you're always very busy." John paused, looking him in the eye, feeling a strange mix of guilt and confusion. What could he say to them? He had never been part of their lives, yet he felt he was already part of theirs. "Sometimes work keeps me very busy, but now," he said, bending down to be at eye level with him, "I want to spend more time with you. Would that be okay?" Arthur nodded with a mischievous smile, and Tommy, who had been listening, joined the conversation. "Does that mean you'll play with us more often?" he asked, his eyes shining with excitement. John smiled, surprised by how easy it was for the children to accept his presence, without complicated questions, without judgments. They were kids. They just wanted to enjoy the moment, and for some reason, John felt that in those fleeting moments of play and laughter, he was finding something he had lost long ago: a real, unselfish connection. Despite the tension still present with Anna, John continued to see the children more frequently. His days, once structured around business and meetings, now included visits to the park, impromptu lunches, and long conversations with two little ones who asked him questions he had never thought he would answer. Over time, the barriers that had existed between them began to crumble, and John started to discover a new facet of himself, that of a man who, for the first time, was experiencing something akin to fatherhood. But alongside this new reality came new internal conflicts. John couldn't ignore the struggle that was unfolding in his mind. On one hand, there was his growing attachment to the children, a feeling that softened him in a way he never thought possible. On the other hand, there was the looming legal battle with the sperm bank. Javier, his private investigator, continued to uncover layers of corruption within the institution, and each new revelation heightened the conflict within John. Should he proceed with the lawsuit, exposing the truth and unleashing a scandal that would affect not only him, but also Anna and the children? The investigation had revealed that John was not the only one affected by the sperm bank. Several powerful men had been victims of the same privacy violation. Some were already considering legal action, while others preferred to bury the scandal to protect their reputations. John found himself trapped between the desire for justice and the growing awareness that the truth, if exposed, could have devastating consequences for his new reality. One afternoon, while they were at the park, Anna confronted him. They had managed to maintain a tacit truce regarding the children, but Anna still feared what John might do if he decided to claim some sort of control over their lives. "You can't just appear and disappear from their lives, John," she said, watching the twins play in the distance. The kids are starting to get attached to you, and that worries me. John looked at her, knowing that behind her words lay a truth they could no longer ignore. Anna was concerned not only for the emotional well-being of the children, but also for the risk that John might decide to wield his power to take control of their upbringing. "I don't want to hurt them, Anna," he replied, his tone revealing more vulnerability than he intended. "I know this is complicated, but I can't just step away from their lives, not after what has happened." Anna looked at him, visibly anxious. She knew John had good intentions, but she also understood his capacity to exert control in any situation he touched. Her greatest fear wasn't that John wanted to be present in the children's lives, but that at some point he might decide he needed a more significant role, perhaps even seek custody. "I'm afraid one day you'll decide they're more yours than mine," Anna confessed, her voice trembling. "I've fought so hard to raise them alone. I don't know if I can fight against you if you decide to take that from me." John fell silent for a moment. He had never considered the situation from that perspective, but hearing Anna's words stirred something within him. He understood her fear, but he also felt he had a right to be in the children's lives. However, he didn't want to be a destructive force in their lives. How could he balance both? "I don't want to take the kids from you, Anna," he finally said, "but I can't ignore what I feel for them. Tommy and Arthur are my children too, and while this is complicated for both of us, I don't want them to feel like I'm only here temporarily. They deserve to know that, no matter what happens, I'll be here for them." Anna watched him, recognizing the sincerity in his voice. Although uncertainty still lingered, she felt a small spark of relief. John was not someone who backed down from a challenge, and while his presence in the children's lives unsettled her, she also understood that the twins needed that father figure they had somehow found in him. "Just promise me you won't do anything that hurts them," Anna pleaded, knowing that was the only promise she needed to move forward. John nodded, looking at her seriously. "I promise you, Anna. I won't do anything that hurts them. They are the most important thing now." Weeks passed, and although Michael's shadow still loomed over their lives, John and Anna found a way to coexist in this new balance. John hired additional security to ensure that Michael couldn't get close to the children, and he kept Javier investigating any movements of her ex-husband, ready to intervene if the situation became dangerous. However, the biggest dilemma remained the investigation into the sperm bank. John knew that proceeding with the lawsuit could unleash a scandal that would shake not only his life, but also that of Anna and the children. But at the same time, he felt an obligation to seek justice and punish those who had violated his privacy in such a fundamental way. Meanwhile, moments with Tommy and Arthur provided John with a respite from everything else. Each laugh, each innocent conversation with the children connected him more deeply with a part of himself he had never explored. For the first time, John began to understand that true power wasn't in controlling every aspect of his life, but in opening himself to the human connections he had avoided before. But the peace he had found was fragile, and he knew that sooner or later he would have to make a decision that would change everything. The future of the children, and his own, depended on it. The atmosphere at Anna's home had become unsettling. Since Michael had reappeared in their lives, fear had settled back into every corner of their daily routine. Although John had taken steps to protect them, Anna knew they couldn't let their guard down. Michael was not a man who easily gave up. Her ex-husband had proven time and again that when it came to getting what he wanted, he was relentless. John, for his part, was also tense. He had hired security to monitor Michael's movements, but he knew the situation wouldn't be resolved with surveillance alone. Michael was a real threat, and worst of all, he now knew that the twins were his children. For someone as manipulative as him, that information was pure gold. Michael could blackmail them, and John knew he was looking for the perfect moment to strike. One day, the attack finally came. Michael appeared unexpectedly, not with physical violence, but with something John feared even more, Blackmail. Michael summoned him to a discreet location, and although everything in John screamed that he shouldn't go, he knew he had to face him. The last thing he wanted was for Michael to continue hovering around Anna and the children unchecked. They met at a cafe on the outskirts of the city. Michael was waiting for him with a twisted smile, one that radiated a confidence that only someone used to manipulating others could possess. John took a seat across from him, frowning and clenching his fists. Everything inside him screamed to take control of the situation, but he also knew that Michael had come prepared to play dirty. "You're always so punctual, John," Michael said, not bothering to conceal his sarcastic tone. "I knew you'd be a reliable businessman." John didn't respond immediately. He wanted to measure his words, maintain control. "Tell me what you want, Michael. We both know you didn't come here for a friendly visit," John replied, his voice thick with tension. Michael smiled, his gaze sharp as a knife. "Oh, I know what I want, and I think you do too. All of this," he gestured widely with his hands, "this life, your relationship with Anna, the kids, Tommy and Arthur, right? How adorable they are. Although," Michael paused, his smile turning darker, "it would be a shame if something were to happen to them, wouldn't it?" John felt a surge of anger coursing through him. Michael had played his most dangerous card, threatening the children. "If you dare to come near them, you won't live to tell the tale," John replied, with a coldness that surprised even Michael. Nothing was more dangerous than a man willing to protect his children. But Michael didn't flinch at the threat. Instead, he tilted his head to the side as if savoring the moment. "I'm not here to harm you directly, John. I'm more sophisticated than that. What I want is simple. Money. A good amount of money, and I'll disappear from your life, from Anna's, and from the kids' lives forever. But if not..." Michael paused dramatically. "I can make this very, very uncomfortable. I can tell the whole world about your secret family, about how you have 2 twin children that no one knew existed. Imagine what that would do to your reputation, to your perfect life." John gritted his teeth. He knew Michael had been waiting for this moment. Anna's ex-husband had been watching and waiting for the time when he could use this information to gain leverage. And now, he was doing just that. Michael didn't just want money, he wanted power, and that made him even more dangerous. "How much?" John asked, cutting straight to the point. Michael grinned widely. He knew he had the upper hand. $5 million, transferred to an account I'll give you. If you do it, I'll leave. If not, well, you and I know what comes next." John watched him in silence. He knew he couldn't simply give in to blackmail, but he also couldn't risk Michael following through on his threat. Exposing Tommy and Arthur to the public eye, turning their story into a media scandal, could ruin the lives of the children and Anna. He couldn't allow that. "How do I know you'll uphold your end?" John asked, his mind racing, searching for a way out of this trap. Michael shrugged, his smile full of self-satisfaction. "You don't. But since I'm a reasonable man, I'll give you 2 weeks. If I see the money in the account, I'll leave. If not, you can prepare for your little secret to come to light." With those final words, Michael got up from the table and left, leaving John with an impossible decision. John returned to his office, his mind swirling with thoughts and emotions. He couldn't share what had just happened with Anna, not yet. He knew she would be devastated, frightened, and that would only worsen the situation. He needed a solution, and fast. That same night, John met with Javier, the private investigator. He explained the situation with Michael, the threats, the blackmail, and what was at stake. "I want to know everything about Michael, every move he makes, every contact he has. I need something to turn this around. I can't let him control the situation," John said, his voice laced with contained rage. Javier nodded, taking notes. He knew Michael was a dangerous man, but he also knew that when it came to situations like this, there was always something that could tip the scales. "Give me a few days, John. I'll find something we can use." As Javier began his investigation, John found himself trapped in a web of difficult decisions. Michael posed a tangible threat, but what worried him most was how to protect Anna and the children. If he paid the blackmail, he would give Michael exactly what he wanted, and that would only encourage him to come back in the future. But if he didn't, he risked public exposure and irreparable harm to his family. The tension between him and Anna was palpable in every interaction. Although he hadn't told her about Michael's blackmail, she could feel that something was wrong. And what scared her most was the possibility that John, in his attempt to protect the children, might make decisions that left her without control over her life. Finally, John decided to act. He knew he couldn't face Michael solely through legal means. He needed to be smart, more cunning than him, and exploit any weaknesses Javier might find. This wasn't just about money or power, it was about protecting what he now considered his family, a family he had never expected to have, but could no longer imagine losing. The atmosphere had changed in the past few weeks. Although John had taken steps to contain Michael and kept Javier investigating tirelessly, he felt that the danger was closer than he could see. Michael was unpredictable, and that feeling that something was about to happen kept John in a state of constant alert. Anna, although unaware of the details of the blackmail, also sensed the growing tension. And as if fate were waiting for the perfect moment to strike, disaster arrived in the worst possible way. One afternoon, while Anna was picking up Tommy and Arthur from school, she noticed a car parked nearby, a dark, discreet vehicle. At first glance, it seemed like any other car, but her heart raced when she saw Michael inside, watching from a distance. She hadn't seen him physically for weeks, even though the threats and veiled messages hadn't ceased. Now she knew her ex-husband was about to do something, but she could never have imagined the magnitude of what he was planning. The next day, while the children were playing in the park with other friends, Anna was distracted for just a few seconds, enough time for Michael to act. Suddenly, the park that had once been filled with laughter and play transformed into a nightmare scene. Anna looked around, desperately searching for the twins, but she couldn't see them anywhere. She shouted their names, Tommy, Arthur, but only the echo of her own voice resonated in the air. Her heart began to race. Anna ran through the park, frantically looking between the trees, in the play areas, in every corner, but there was no trace of them. Her worst fear came true when she noticed, in the distance, Michael's dark car speeding away. "No!" Anna cried out, unable to contain her panic. She knew Michael had taken the children. Shaking and with her voice broken by fear, Anna called John. She could barely articulate the words, but he understood enough. Michael had kidnapped Tommy and Arthur. John wasted no time. From the moment he received Anna's call, a wave of rage and terror washed over him. He knew Michael had crossed a line he should never have crossed, and now it wasn't just about money or threats. It was about the safety of the children, his children. He headed straight to Anna's house, where he found her in shock, crying and trembling. John, although also feeling the weight of fear, forced himself to stay calm. "We'll find them, Anna," he said, with a determination that allowed no doubts. "I won't let him harm the children." Javier was already aware of the situation. John called him immediately, and he set all his resources in motion to track down Michael. They had surveillance cameras, contacts in strategic places, and, more importantly, the will to act quickly. "I've got it," said Javier just a few hours later. "He's in an abandoned house on the outskirts of the city. It looks like he plans to hide out there with the kids." John didn't hesitate for a second. Along with Javier and a team of private security he had hired, he headed to the specified location. The drive was hell for John. With every passing minute without Tommy and Arthur under his protection, he felt his heart tearing apart. He had never experienced such intense fear, a sense of helplessness that suffocated him with each second that went by. When they arrived at the site, an old house surrounded by weeds and neglect, the security team moved in silence, ensuring there was no imminent danger. John stayed back for a few seconds, but the need to be with his children was too strong. "I'm going in," he said firmly. Javier tried to stop him. "It's dangerous, John. We don't know how Michael will react. He could do something desperate." But John had already made up his mind. Michael was not going to hurt his children, not while he was alive. Inside the house, the atmosphere was tense. Michael was sitting in an old wooden chair, a cynical smile on his face. Tommy and Arthur, frightened but unharmed, were huddled in a corner, too young to fully understand what was happening, but aware enough to feel the danger. When John entered the house, Michael greeted him with a cold laugh. "You made it just in time," he said, rising slowly. "I always thought you'd do anything for your kids, and I was right, wasn't I?" John felt anger consume him. He took a step forward, maintaining an outward calm, but inside, every fiber of his being was ready to explode. "Let the kids go, Michael," he said, his voice firm but with contained fury. "Don't involve them any more than you already have. You're only making your situation worse." Michael shrugged, feigning indifference. "You know, I could do that. I could let them go right now. But," his eyes gleamed with malice, "not without getting something in return. I already told you, John. Give me what I want, or everyone loses." John knew he couldn't give in. He couldn't pay the blackmail. It wasn't just about the money. It was what it would mean for Anna, for the kids, and for himself. Michael wouldn't stop with just a payment. He would always come back for more. Javier and the security team were waiting outside, ready to act if things got out of control. But John knew that any misstep could put the kids in danger. Michael was unpredictable, and if he felt cornered, he wouldn't hesitate to make a desperate decision. John took a deep breath and stepped closer to Michael. "Listen well, Michael," he said, with a calmness that even surprised Michael himself. "You're not going to win this game. I'm not giving you a dime. And if you touch those kids, there won't be a place in the world where you can hide from me. So you have one last chance. Release Tommy and Arthur, and maybe you'll find a way out of this alive." For a moment, Michael's smile faltered. It seemed he hadn't expected that response, that relentless coldness from John. And it was in that moment of doubt that Javier and his team burst into the house, moving with military precision. Michael, caught by surprise, tried to back away, but it was already too late. Javier and the guards restrained him before he could react. John rushed to Tommy and Arthur, who, frightened but safe, hugged him tightly. In that moment, he felt all the weight of the world lift off his shoulders. The kids were safe. Michael had been apprehended. As Michael was escorted out of the house, he continued to try to maintain his facade of control. "This isn't over, John. There will always be a way to win." John looked at him one last time, his expression filled with a mix of relief and disdain. "No, Michael. For you, this is over." That night, John brought the kids back to Anna. When she saw them, safe and sound, she broke down, hugging them with a mix of relief and gratitude. John, although exhausted from the day's intensity, also felt that something inside him had changed forever. There was no going back now. Tommy and Arthur were his children, and he would protect them at any cost. Michael was arrested, and although the legal process that would follow would be long, John and Anna knew that at least for now, the threat had been eliminated. However, as he sat that night with Anna, watching the children sleep after their terrifying experience, John knew this wasn't the end. There were other battles to face, including how to handle the sperm bank scandal and his relationship with Anna. But for now, the relief of having Tommy and Arthur safe was enough. The silence in John's mansion that morning was almost deafening. The events of the past few days had left a deep mark on everyone. After Tommy and Arthur's kidnapping and Michael's arrest, John and Anna knew that although the children were safe, their lives would never be the same. The tension of uncertainty and fear still hung in the air, but with it also came a new reality that neither of them could ignore. They were in this together, for the kids and for everything that would come next. John woke up early that morning, more emotionally drained than he had been in years. Although the immediate threat of Michael had vanished, the sense of responsibility toward Tommy and Arthur had not faded. On the contrary, it had grown. The twins had hugged him tightly the night before falling asleep. For them, John was no longer just a distant figure or someone who showed up occasionally. He was a protective and constant presence in their lives, and although he had never sought it, he had fully embraced that role. The problem was that he now had to decide how to proceed. Michael was behind bars, but the shadows of the past still lingered. There was a legal battle underway, one he couldn't ignore, the case against the sperm bank that had used his DNA without his consent. The scandal not only affected him, but also many others who had been victims of that corruption. And if he chose to move forward, he knew it would expose Tommy, Arthur, and Anna to a level of public attention that could shatter the fragile stability they had achieved. That same day, Javier arrived with a detailed report on the legal case. He had delved deeper into the investigations, and now John had all the information about the corruption network at the sperm bank in his hands. Several wealthy and powerful men had been victims like him, but there were also women, like Anna, who had been manipulated by a hollow promise of accessible fertilization. It was a scandal that could ruin careers, families, and entire lives. But justice had to prevail, didn't it? Javier entered John's office, knowing that what he was about to discuss was not just a business matter. He sat down across from him, placing the report on the table. "I've gathered all the information you requested. The sperm bank has been involved in these kinds of operations for years, using the DNA of men like you without their consent. Most of the victims are already taking legal action, but some prefer to keep everything under wraps to protect their privacy." John looked at the report without touching it, his thoughts wandering. What should he do? If he proceeded with the lawsuit, he would bring everything to light, but it would also jeopardize Anna and the children's privacy. If he didn't, he felt he would betray the need for justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been victimized. "It's not an easy decision, John," Javier continued, aware of the dilemma. "If you take legal action, the case will become public, and you know what that could mean for the kids. On the other hand, if you do nothing, these people will continue operating without consequences." John stood up from his chair, walking over to the window of his office and looking out at the garden. He knew the decision he made would define not just his life, but also that of Tommy, Arthur, and Anna. "I can't let these people go unpunished," he finally said, his voice laden with resolve. "But I can't destroy Anna's and the kids' lives either. There's more at stake here than just my reputation." Javier nodded, fully understanding the gravity of the situation. "We can negotiate a solution, John. Maybe we can resolve the case without exposing your family too much. It will be complicated, but not impossible." John continued looking out the window, knowing that even with a negotiation, damage could be inevitable. Anna and the kids had already been through so much. How could he expose them to more suffering? That same afternoon, Anna came to see John. She knew he was dealing with a lot, and even though things between them remained tense, they needed to discuss what was coming. Tommy and Arthur had been calmer since the kidnapping, but they were still kids, and sooner or later, they would start asking questions. Anna didn't know how to explain everything that was happening. She didn't know whether to tell them the whole truth or protect them from the cruel world they lived in. When she arrived at John's office, she found him sitting at his desk with an exhausted but determined expression. The case report lay open in front of him. "How are the kids?" John asked, breaking the silence as Anna took a seat across from him. "They're fine," she replied with a faint smile. "They're asking about you. They want to know if you're coming to see them today." John felt a wave of warmth in his chest. Tommy and Arthur accepted him as part of their lives, and that was something he had never expected. But with that acceptance came a responsibility that grew more evident each day. "I want to talk to you about what's coming," John said, his voice more serious. "Michael is no longer an immediate threat, but the case against the sperm bank is still pending. I have the opportunity to take this to the end, to seek justice for what they did to you and me, to the kids. But if I do, our life, he paused, choosing his words carefully, will never be the same. The world will know about Tommy and Arthur, about how they were conceived. I can't guarantee we can protect them from everything that implies. Anna looked at him, feeling the weight of his dilemma. She had spent years protecting her children, fighting to give them a quiet life, and now the idea that all of that could crumble terrified her. But she also knew that John was right. They couldn't let corruption and injustice go unpunished. "What will you do, John?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't want the kids to suffer, but I also don't want to live in fear forever. We can't keep looking the other way." John nodded. He knew Anna was right. The time had come to make a definitive decision. "I'm going to proceed with the case," he said, with a determination that allowed no doubts. "But I'll do it in a way that minimizes the impact on the kids. I'll hire the best lawyers, and if necessary, I'll negotiate a settlement that allows us to seek justice without exposing more than we have to. I won't let this destroy our lives, but I also won't let them continue getting away with this." Anna sighed, partly relieved, though she knew the road ahead would be difficult. But for the first time in a long while, she felt she wasn't alone. John was by her side, and together they would face whatever came their way. That night, John and Anna sat together in the garden of the mansion, watching Tommy and Arthur run and play. The children, oblivious to everything happening around them, laughed and had fun, and for a moment, the world seemed like a simpler, less chaotic place. John looked at Anna, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a deep connection with her. It was not just about the kids, it was about the two of them, about what they had been through, and about what they might be starting to build together. Anna, with all her courage and determination, had fought for her children alone for years. But now John was there, and he was ready to fight too. "Thank you for being here," Anna said, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. "I know it hasn't been easy for you." John looked at her, and a small smile formed on his face. "No, it hasn't been easy, but nothing worth having ever is, right?" Anna smiled too, and together, in that brief moment of peace, they knew that although the road ahead remained uncertain, they would face it as a family. It had been almost a year since the kidnapping of Tommy and Arthur, and both John's and Anna's worlds had changed irreparably, but they had also found a new kind of balance. The legal case against the sperm bank had been resolved discreetly, thanks to the expertise of the lawyers John had hired. There were no public trials or media exposés. The culprits were punished, the sperm bank was shut down, and John had managed to achieve justice without sacrificing the privacy of his new family. John found himself in a situation he had never imagined, living a life where power and success were not the only important things. He had discovered a new source of satisfaction, one that didn't depend on numbers or contracts, but on the emotional connection with the two children who, though unplanned, had filled his life with a purpose he had never felt before. Tommy and Arthur, who at first saw him as a mysterious and distant figure, now considered him a fundamental part of their lives. The bonds between them had grown stronger with each passing day, and for John, they were no longer just a responsibility. They were his family. The afternoon sun softly illuminated the garden of John's mansion, where Tommy and Arthur played carefree. Anna watched them from the porch, holding a cup of tea, smiling at her children's laughter. It had been a long time since she had allowed herself to relax in that way. The constant fear that Michael had instilled in her life no longer tormented her. Now, with Michael serving a lengthy sentence for kidnapping and extortion, Anna could look to the future with hope, free from the shadow of her ex-husband looming over her. John joined her on the porch, wearing a calm yet reflective expression. They had both come a long way to reach this point, and while challenges had not completely disappeared, they knew they were in this together. The peace that had settled over them was not just external, it was internal, a tranquility that stemmed from having faced their worst fears and come out stronger on the other side. "It's amazing how everything has changed, isn't it?" Anna commented, watching the kids, who ran back and forth, happy and carefree. John nodded, following her gaze. He had gone from being a man who avoided any kind of emotional connection to someone who could no longer imagine his life without these two energetic and joyful little beings. "I never thought this would be part of my life," he admitted with a gentle smile. "But now, I can't imagine it any other way." Anna looked at him, noticing the sincerity in his words. For a long time, she had feared that John, with his power and control, might try to take the kids from her, but that fear no longer existed. John had not come to destroy what she had built, but to be a part of it, to share the responsibility and love for Tommy and Arthur. "Me neither," Anna responded. "I never thought you could change so much." John chuckled lightly, acknowledging the truth in her words. He knew he was no longer the solitary, controlling man he had once been. The children had changed him. Anna had changed him. And though he had never imagined it, he now understood that true success wasn't found in business or power, but in the connections he forged with the people he cared about. "It's funny how plans change," John continued, watching the kids. "All this time, I thought the only thing I needed was to maintain control over my life. And now, all I truly care about is them. And you." Anna looked at him, surprised by the frankness of his words. They had been through so much together, and while their relationship had never been straightforward, something new was growing between them. A respect, a complicity, and perhaps something more. It wasn't easy, but both had proven they could face any obstacle and come out stronger. Tommy and Arthur ran toward them, interrupting the moment with their infectious laughter. Arthur, with his mischievous smile, lunged at John. "Dad, come play," he said, pulling him by the hand. Dad. The word resonated in John's ears in a way that left him momentarily breathless. He had heard the children call him that several times since the kidnapping, but each time they did, the emotional impact was just as profound. He had never imagined being called that, but now that he was, he felt a warmth and pride he couldn't describe. All right, John replied, laughing as he got up from the porch. "Let's go, but don't complain if I win." Anna watched the scene, feeling more at peace than she had in years. As she saw John playing with the kids, she knew that the road they had traveled, filled with difficulties, had been worth it. It hadn't been easy, and they would likely face more challenges in the future, but what mattered was that they were no longer alone. They had built something together, something no enemy, no threat could destroy. That night, after the children fell asleep, Anna and John sat together in the living room, sharing a quiet conversation under the soft glow of the lamp. "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next," John said, gazing into the fire in the fireplace. "After everything we've been through, I want you to know that I will always be here for you. I don't know what the future holds, but I have no intention of stepping away." Anna looked at him, feeling a mix of relief and gratitude. "The kids need you," she replied softly, "and so do I." John took her hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable for him before, but now felt completely natural. It was the beginning of something new, something he wasn't sure how to define, but knew he wanted to explore. Together, John and Anna looked toward the future with a mix of hope and caution. The past had been difficult, but they had faced it together. And as long as they had Tommy and Arthur, they knew anything was possible. The life they had built, though unexpected, was theirs. Not perfect, but filled with love, strength, and most importantly, a new family. A family that didn't rely on blood ties, but on the choices they made to care for one another. And that, ultimately, was what really mattered. And here we conclude this incredible story filled with twists, emotions, and redemption. If it captivated you as much as it did us, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our upcoming stories filled with intrigue, romance, and unexpected surprises. Remember, in life, sometimes destiny leads us down paths we never imagined, but it's always in our hands how we face those challenges. See you in the next video to keep exploring the power of stories that transform us. Thank you for being here, and until next time.